Hi, welcome. The ink on the divorce papers was barely dry when Victor's words echoed in the sterile lawyer's office. A final cruel twist of the knife. She'll come crawling back, he'd sneered, his voice dripping with the same condescending certainty that had defined their marriage. Mark my words, within a week she'll be begging. That night, huddled in a cheap motel room with nothing but a worn-out suitcase and the secret of a new life growing inside her, Nora believed him. She felt the weight of his prediction pressing down, a prophecy of her failure. But she was wrong. The next morning didn't bring despair. It brought the thunderous roar of a private jet, a silhouette against the dawn, sent by a billionaire ghost from her past to shatter Victor's world forever. The lawyer's office on the 47th floor felt like a pristine soundproof cage in the sky. Sunlight, sharp and indifferent, sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air. The only sign of imperfection in the entire room. Nora sat perfectly still on a leather chair that was too large and too cold. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. The scent of old paper, expensive cologne, and a faint cloying lemon polish filled her nostrils, a smell she would forever associate with the end of her world. Across the vast mahogany desk, Victor adjusted his tie, a sliver of silk the color of a stormy sea. His movements were fluid, economical, betraying no emotion. He hadn't looked her in the eye once since they'd arrived. His focus was entirely on the stack of papers his lawyer, a man with a reptilian smile and eyes to match, pushed toward him. Victor's signature was a confident angular slash of black ink, a brand. The final seal on their shared history. When it was her turn, Nora's hand trembled. The pen felt alien in her fingers, heavy and slick. She traced the letters of her name, Nora Harrington, soon to be Nora Vale again, and the act felt like a betrayal of the woman she had tried so hard to be for him. A ghost of a memory surfaced, Victor guiding her hand to sign their marriage license, his touch warm, his whisper promising forever. The memory was a phantom limb, an ache for something that had never truly existed. Is that everything? Victor's voice cut through her reverie. It was the voice he used for business, clipped and impatient. His lawyer, Mr. Cavern, nodded, gathering the documents with a smug finality. All settled, Mr. Harrington. The assets are divided as per the agreement. Ms. Vale will vacate the penthouse by 5 p.m. this evening. Ms. Vale. The name felt both foreign and like a homecoming. She was no longer Mrs. Harrington, a title that had felt more like a job description than an identity. She was just Nora again. The thought should have been liberating, but it felt like stepping off a cliff into thin air. As they stood to leave, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Nora finally met Victor's gaze, searching for a flicker of regret, of shared loss, of anything other than this cold corporate dismissal. She found nothing. His eyes, the color of polished steel, were unreadable, but then a corner of his mouth lifted into that familiar, condescending smirk. It was the expression he wore right before he delivered a killing blow in a boardroom or in their living room. He leaned toward Mr. Cavanagh, but his voice was loud enough for her to hear a deliberate performance. "She'll come crawling back," he said, the words a low, confident rumble. "Mark my words, within a week she'll be begging. She can't survive without me." The cruelty was so pure, so potent, it stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't just an insult. It was his narrative, the story he'd been writing for her throughout their 5-year marriage. "You're too sensitive, Nora. You're not strong enough. You need me." "Mr." Kavanagh chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Nora felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to shatter the perfect, sterile composure of the room. But his words had their intended effect. They paralyzed her. Years of being diminished, of having her reality questioned and her confidence systematically dismantled, had left their mark. A part of her, a small terrified part, whispered that he was right. She walked out of the office in a daze. The city noise a distant hum. The elevator ride down was a silent eternity. Victor stood beside her, checking his phone, already moving on to the next item on his agenda. When the doors opened to the marble-clad lobby, he walked away without a backward glance, disappearing into the back seat of a waiting black car that purred at the curb like a tamed panther. He didn't say goodbye. The finality of it was absolute. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone. The settlement, which his lawyers had made sound generous, was a pittance compared to his vast fortune, just enough to ensure she wouldn't be a nuisance. It wouldn't last long in a city that devoured money and dreams with equal rapacity. She hailed a taxi, her voice a reedy whisper, and gave the address of the only place she could afford, a dingy motel on the edge of town, a place of transient souls and flickering neon signs. As the cab pulled away from the gleaming steel and glass tower of Harrington Holdings, Nora pressed her hand against her stomach, a gesture that was becoming second nature. Beneath the thin fabric of her dress, a secret lay nestled. A life their child. A truth she had discovered just 3 weeks ago. A truth she had tried to tell him, only to be met with accusations of manipulation, of trying to trap him. A convenient discovery. Nora, he had said, his voice laced with ice. Don't insult my intelligence. He refused to believe it. He refused to even look at the doctor's report. It didn't fit his narrative of a clean break, so he had simply erased it. Huddled in the back seat, watching the city lights blur into streaks of cold fire, Victor's final words echoed in her mind. She'll be begging. Tears she had refused to shed in front of him now streamed down her face, hot and silent. In that moment, in the suffocating grip of fear and despair, she believed him. How could she possibly survive? Pregnant, penniless, and utterly broken. He had won. He had taken everything. The motel room was a study in beige and brown, a symphony of faded aspirations. The carpet, a swirling pattern of indeterminate stains, felt sticky under her worn heels. The air was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 lonely nights, stale cigarette smoke, cheap air freshener, and an underlying scent of bleach that couldn't quite erase the desperation. A single bare bulb in the ceiling lamp cast a sickly yellow glow, turning the room into a jaundiced cage. Nora dropped her suitcase by the door. It was a small scuffed leather case, the one she'd owned before Victor, a relic from a life she barely remembered. It contained a few changes of clothes, a handful of toiletries, and a worn paperback novel. The sum total of the personal effects she'd been allowed to retrieve from the penthouse. Everything else, the art, the designer wardrobe, the carefully curated life, had belonged to Mrs. Harrington, and Mrs. Harrington was now defunct. She sank onto the edge of the bed. The mattress groaned in protest. Its springs a chorus of weary sighs. She stared at the water-stained ceiling, tracing the faint map-like patterns with her eyes. This was it, the first night of her new life. Freedom. It felt less like liberation and more like being cast adrift in a cold black ocean. Victor's words replayed in her mind a cruel, relentless loop. She can't survive without me. He had engineered this. He hadn't just divorced her. He had tried to erase her. The power imbalance had been there from the start, a subtle undercurrent that had grown into a tidal wave. He was Victor Harrington, the self-made titan of finance, a man who bent the world to his will. She was just Nora Vale, the quiet art history student he'd plucked from obscurity, dazzled with a life she'd never imagined, and then molded into the perfect polished accessory for his arm. He had isolated her slowly and methodically. Her friends, he'd claimed, were unimpressed by his success or using her to get to him. Her family, with their modest middle-class values, just didn't understand their world. He had convinced her that his way was the only way, that his opinions were facts, that her own feelings were unreliable, hysterical even. He'd made her world so small that he was its only inhabitant, and now he had kicked her out of it. A wave of nausea rolled over her, sharp and acidic. Morning sickness, the doctor had called it, though for her it was an all-day affair, a constant physical reminder of the secret she carried. She stumbled to the bathroom, her hand pressed to her mouth. The reflection that stared back at her from the cracked mirror was a stranger. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and haunted, framed by dark circles of exhaustion. The bespoke silk dress she still wore, a relic from her morning's execution, looked absurd in this grim setting. She was a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life that had been built on a foundation of lies. He had never loved her. He had loved the idea of her, beautiful, pliable, intelligent enough to be interesting, but not so much as to be a threat, someone he could control. The pregnancy had been an unforeseen variable, a complication in his meticulously planned life, and he had dealt with it with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to a failing stock. He cut his losses. She stripped off the dress, letting it fall into a silken puddle on the grimy linoleum floor. She stood under the weak, lukewarm spray of the shower, scrubbing at her skin as if she could wash away his touch, his scent, his influence. But the chill she felt was bone deep, a cold that no amount of hot water could touch. Wrapped in a threadbare towel, she curled up on the bed, the fear a living thing in her gut. How was she going to do this? The money in her account would barely cover a few months' rent on a tiny apartment, let alone the costs of prenatal care, of having a baby. She had no job, no recent work experience. The art gallery she had dreamed of opening had been dismissed by Victor as a cute little hobby, a distraction from her real duties as his wife. Sleep felt like an impossible luxury. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, that confident smirk, and heard his voice pronouncing her doom, begging. The word was a brand on her soul. Sometime in the gray pre-dawn hours, exhaustion finally claimed her. Her sleep was shallow and fitful, punctuated by nightmares of falling, of drowning, of being trapped in silent, screaming rooms. She was jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong. It was a low, powerful purr, a sound of refined engineering that cut through the usual symphony of distant sirens and rumbling trucks. It was close, too close. Heart pounding, Nora crept to the window and peeled back a corner of the grimy curtain. Her breath caught in her throat. Parked directly in front of her motel room door, gleaming under the flickering neon sign, was a black Maybach. It was long, sleek, and impossibly elegant. A panther in a junkyard. It was the kind of car that didn't just suggest wealth. It screamed it. A silent, authoritative roar of power. Her first thought was, Victor. He'd come to gloat to see her in this pathetic state to prove his point. A cold dread washed over her. But this wasn't Victor's car. His was a custom Rolls-Royce, a more ostentatious display. This was different, subtler, yet somehow more intimidating. The driver's door opened, and a man in a crisp, dark suit stepped out. He was tall and impassive, his expression unreadable. He didn't approach her door. Instead, he walked to the rear passenger door and opened it with a quiet, reverent motion, as if for royalty. He stood there holding the door open, his gaze fixed on her window. He wasn't looking at the room in general. He was looking directly at her. He knew she was there. A knock, soft but firm, echoed on her door. Nora froze, her hand still clutching the curtain. It couldn't be Victor. This wasn't his style. His cruelty was verbal, psychological. This felt different. This was something else entirely. Her mind raced, sifting through a Rolodex of forgotten acquaintances of people from her prefter life. Who could possibly know she was here? The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. It wasn't threatening, but it was clear the person on the other side would not be ignored. Gathering the thin motel blanket around her trembling body, Nora took a deep breath. She didn't know if she was walking toward a threat or a rescue, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't stay in this room. The longest night of her life was over. Dawn was breaking, and something or someone had just arrived. Nora's hand hovered over the cheap brass doorknob, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every instinct honed by years of walking on eggshells around Victor's moods screamed at her not to open it. Strangers in the pre-dawn hours at a place like this were never good news. But the quiet authority of the scene outside the impossibly expensive car, the stoic driver, overrode her fear with a powerful, disorienting curiosity. This wasn't random. This was intentional. She turned the lock, the click echoing loudly in the small room. The door swung inward on a protesting creak. Standing on the cracked concrete walkway was not the driver, but a woman. She was in her late 50s with kind, intelligent eyes and silver hair pulled back into a severe but elegant chignon. She wore a simple, perfectly tailored gray pantsuit. Her expression was one of calm professionalism, yet there was a softness around her mouth that put Nora immediately at ease. "Miss Vale?" the woman asked, her voice calm and melodious. "My name is Evelyn Carr. I've been sent to collect you." Nora clutched the blanket tighter. "Collect me? I don't understand. Who sent you?" Evelyn offered a small, reassuring smile. "My employer would prefer to explain in person. He was most insistent that we retrieve you with all due haste. He was concerned for your well-being." The word hung in the cool morning air. Concerned for your well-being. The phrase was so foreign, so antithetical to her recent reality that Nora almost laughed. Concern was not a currency in Victor's world. I'm not going anywhere," Nora stammered, even as she knew it was a lie. The squalor of the motel room behind her was a powerful argument. "You have the wrong person." Nora Vale, formerly Harrington, recently finalized her divorce from Victor Harrington, graduated from Columbia with a master's in art history, grew up in Northwood, a small town upstate. Evelyn recited the details not like an accusation, but like a simple statement of fact. "There is no mistake. We have a change of clothes for you in the car and breakfast if you'd like. We have a flight to catch, a flight." The scale of it, the sheer audacity sent a dizzying wave through Nora. This was beyond anything she could comprehend. Her mind, still mired in the trauma of the past 24 hours, struggled to process the information. "Please, Miss Vale," Evelyn said, her tone gentle but firm. "He is waiting. I can assure you you are in no danger." Quite the opposite. Something in the woman's steady gaze, a deep, unwavering sincerity broke through Nora's panic. She looked past Evelyn to the waiting Maybach. A silent black promise of a world away from this one. What did she have to lose? A stained mattress and a future defined by her ex-husband's cruel prophecy. She nodded, a small jerky movement. "Let me just a minute." She closed the door and moved on autopilot. She dressed quickly in the simple jeans and sweater she had packed, her hands shaking as she pulled them on. She glanced at her reflection one last time. The woman in the mirror was still pale, still frightened. But a tiny spark of something new flickered in her eyes. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was bewilderment. When she stepped out of the room, suitcase in hand, the driver materialized silently, taking the bag from her before she could protest, and stowing it in the trunk. Evelyn held the car door open for her. The interior was a cocoon of soft cream-colored leather and polished burr walnut. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and cedar. It was so quiet the world outside seemed to disappear. On the seat opposite her was a cashmere travel blanket, a bottle of water, and a small insulated bag. As the car pulled away from the motel, Nora didn't look back. The Maybach moved with a silent, powerful grace, gliding through the awakening city like a phantom. Evelyn sat beside her, respecting her silence, creating an oasis of calm. Nora opened the insulated bag. Inside was a warm croissant, fresh fruit, and a flask of herbal tea. She ate slowly, the simple act of nourishment, a balm to her frayed nerves. They drove not into the city, but toward its outskirts, to a smaller private airfield she never knew existed. There were no crowds, no long security lines. The car drove directly onto the tarmac, stopping at the base of a sleek white private jet whose engines were already whining softly. The morning sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Nora noticed the beauty of the dawn. As she stepped out of the car and walked toward the jet, the pieces began to click into place, forming a picture she hadn't allowed herself to consider for a very, very long time. There was only one person she had ever known with this level of wealth, this kind of quiet, understated power. A person who knew her history, who knew where she came from, a ghost from her childhood. A figure appeared at the top of the jet stairs, silhouetted against the bright cabin light. He was tall and lean, dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers, but he wore them with an air of innate confidence. As he descended the steps, his features came into focus. He had the same dark, unruly hair, she remembered, though it was cut shorter now, the same intense, thoughtful eyes, the color of dark honey. But the boyish awkwardness was gone, replaced by the sharp, defined lines of a man who carried immense responsibility. The last time she had seen him, he had been a scholarship kid with patched jeans and a fierce, hungry intelligence. Now he commanded the world around him with a quiet, effortless authority. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands in his pockets, a gesture she recognized from their youth. A flicker of a smile, hesitant and tinged with something she couldn't quite decipher, regret perhaps, touched his lips. "Nora," he said, his voice a low, familiar rumble that vibrated through the years of silence. And the name, a name no one had called her since she was a teenager, a name Victor had despised, broke the final dam of her composure. "Rowan," she breathed, the name a whisper of disbelief. Rowan Lockwood, the ghost of a promise made 2 decades ago in a moonlit treehouse under a canopy of summer stars, had just materialized on a private runway, ready to catch her fall. The interior of the Gulfstream G650 was less a cabin and more a flying luxury apartment. Creamy leather seats, polished wood paneling, and brushed steel accents created an atmosphere of serene, minimalist opulence. It was a world away from the commercial flights Nora had occasionally taken with Victor, where even first class felt crowded and performative. Here there was only the soft hum of the engines and the vast, endless blue of the sky outside the large oval windows. Rowan gestured for her to take a seat, a plush armchair that swiveled to face a matching one across a small, inlaid table. Evelyn Carr gave them a discreet nod before disappearing toward the front of the plane, leaving them in a bubble of suspended reality. 30,000 feet above the world that had shattered Nora's life. Silence, thick and heavy with unspoken history, settled between them. Nora stared at the man opposite her, trying to reconcile the Rowan she knew with the one sitting before her now. The Rowan of her memory was a lanky, fiercely brilliant teenager who always had grease under his fingernails from tinkering with old engines and ink stains on his fingers from the books he devoured. He was the boy who had sat next to her in AP Physics, who had patiently explained calculus to her until it finally made sense. He was her best friend, her confidant, the other half of a pact to escape their small, deadened town and conquer the world. Then his father had died. His mother had moved them to California to be with family. And just like that, he was gone. They had promised to write, to call, to stay friends forever. But life, as it so often does, had interfered. Her letters went unanswered. His phone number was disconnected, and slowly the vibrant connection faded into a sepia-toned memory. She had heard whispers years later about him dropping out of Stanford, about some tech startup he'd launched from a garage. She'd assumed he was doing okay. She hadn't grasped the scale of his success. It was clear now that okay was the understatement of the century. Lockhart Aerospace, she now recalled seeing in business journals. It was his. How did you find me? Nora's voice was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the engine's powerful drone. Rowan's gaze was direct, his honey-cold eyes holding hers. I've kept track of you, Nora, from a distance. The admission was quiet, devoid of any sinister undertone. It sounded more like a confession. I have a service that alerts me to certain public records. When the Harrington divorce filing hit the system, I was notified. When I saw the terms of the settlement, I knew Victor hadn't changed. A cold knot formed in Nora's stomach. You know Victor? I know of him, Rowan corrected, his tone hardening almost imperceptibly. Men like Harrington, they operate in a world I have to navigate. Their reputations precede them. He's known for being ruthless, for taking over companies and gutting them, for seeing people as assets or liabilities. I always wondered what he saw in you. He paused, his expression softening. No, that's not right. I knew what he saw. I just hated that he got it. The words hung in the air, imbued with a protective warmth that Nora hadn't felt from anyone in years. It was jarring, disorienting. She was so accustomed to being on the defensive, to having her perceptions twisted, that this straightforward sincerity felt like a foreign language. He said, I wouldn't survive without him, she murmured, the words tasting like ash. He told his lawyer, I'd be begging to come back within a week. A muscle clenched in Rowan's jaw. The air in the cabin seemed to crackle with a sudden contained anger. He's a fool, he said, the words clipped and precise. He mistakes dependence for weakness. He never understood your strength, Nora. He probably never even looked for it. The simple validation, the unwavering belief in her was a powerful antidote to Victor's poison. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, but she fought them back. She wouldn't cry. Not anymore. A flight attendant, as discreet and professional as Evelyn, appeared and offered them drinks. Nora asked for water while Rowan requested black coffee. The simple domesticity of the moment felt surreal. Where are we going? She asked, tracing a condensation ring on the polished table. To my home in Wyoming, he answered. It's quiet, secluded. You'll be safe there. You can think, rest, decide what you want to do next. No pressure, no expectations. Wyoming. The name conjured images of wide, open spaces of mountains and endless sky, the polar opposite of the gilded cage she'd inhabited in Manhattan. The idea was both terrifying and intoxicatingly liberating. Why, Rowan? The question was the one that had been screaming in her mind since she saw his face. Why are you doing this? We haven't spoken in what, 15 years? He He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting to the clouds outside the window. For a moment, she saw the boy again, the thoughtful, introspective teenager wrestling with a problem too complex for a simple answer. When my mom and I moved, he began, his voice low and reflective. Things were bad, worse than I ever told you. We had nothing. The first few years were a struggle. He looked back at her, his eyes holding a universe of pain she had never known about. I tried to write. I had a box of letters I never sent. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. Shame, he admitted, the words stark and unadorned. You were going to Columbia, living this bright, shining life I felt I had been locked out of. I was working 2 jobs, barely keeping my head above water, trying to build something from scratch. I felt like a failure. I told myself I'd get in touch when I had something to offer, when I wasn't the charity case from the wrong side of the tracks anymore. And then time just ran away. I saw you at a gala once years ago. You were with him. You looked like a porcelain doll on a shelf, beautiful and breakable and untouchable. I didn't approach. It felt like I'd missed my chance. His confession was a key, unlocking a part of her past she had sealed away. His silence hadn't been a rejection. It had been a shield for his own pain, his own pride. All these years she had thought he had forgotten her. But he had been watching, waiting. She reached her hand across the table, a hesitant, trembling gesture. He met it instantly, his fingers warm and strong, engulfing hers. It wasn't a romantic touch. It was a connection, a closing of a circuit that had been left open for a decade and a half. In the quiet hum of the jet, soaring miles above the earth, Nora felt the first fragile tendrils of a forgotten feeling, safety. But intertwined with it was a new turbulence, a storm of questions. Rowan was not the boy she remembered. He was a man of immense power and resources, and men with power, as she knew all too well, always had a motive. The descent into Jackson Hole was a masterpiece of natural art. The sky, a vast crystalline blue, gave way to the jagged snow-dusted peaks of the Teton Range, rising like granite deities from the valley floor. Below, the Snake River carved a silver ribbon through sprawling forests of pine and aspen, their autumn colors a blazing tapestry of gold, amber, and crimson. It was a raw, untamed beauty, a stark and breathtaking contrast to the concrete canyons of Manhattan. The jet landed with a gentle bump on a private runway nestled in the valley. As Nora stepped out onto the tarmac, the air hit her first. It was clean, crisp, and so cold it felt like a physical cleansing, scouring the residual grime of the city from her lungs. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. A rugged-looking black Range Rover was waiting. Rowan took her suitcase from the flight attendant, placing it in the back himself before holding the passenger door open for her. The simple act of courtesy felt both archaic and deeply comforting. Victor's drivers had always handled the luggage. Victor himself had never held a door for her. The drive from the airfield was short, winding through dense groves of aspen, whose leaves trembled like golden coins in the breeze. They passed no other cars, saw no other signs of life. Then the trees cleared, and Nora gasped. Perched on a gentle rise overlooking the valley was Rowan's home. It was not a mansion in the traditional ostentatious sense. It was a stunning work of architectural art, a sprawling structure of glass, cedar, and dark gray stone that seemed to grow organically from the landscape. It was modern and minimalist, yet exuded a powerful rustic warmth. Walls of glass framed the epic mountain views, blurring the line between inside and out. It was a fortress of solitude, a sanctuary built to embrace the wilderness, not conquer it. "Welcome to the aviary," Rowan said quietly as he parked the car. "The aviary? I like to watch the eagles," he said with a faint smile. "And it's a place to feel untethered." Inside the house was even more breathtaking. The main living area was a vast open-plan space with a soaring ceiling supported by massive timber beams. A colossal stone fireplace dominated one wall, while the opposite wall was pure glass offering an uninterrupted panorama of the Tetons. The decor was understated and masculine. Worn leather sofas, hand-woven wool rugs, and shelves filled not with trinkets, but with books. Thousands of them on every conceivable subject from quantum physics to ancient history. It was a home built for thinking, for being, not for impressing. Evelyn Carr was there to greet them, her presence as calming and unobtrusive as ever. I've prepared the guest wing for you. Miss Vale, she said. Please, let me show you. Nora followed her down a long, sunlit hallway. The walls were adorned with art, but it wasn't the flashy investment-grade chaos Victor had favored. These were quieter pieces, stunning black and white landscape photographs, intricate astronomical charts, a single, powerful abstract painting that pulsed with color. The guest wing was a self-contained apartment. It had a spacious bedroom with another wall of glass looking out onto a private aspen grove, a bathroom that resembled a high-end spa with a deep soaking tub carved from a single piece of stone, and a cozy sitting room with its own fireplace and a small, well-stocked library. Mr. Lockwood thought you might appreciate your own space, Evelyn explained. Your suitcase is in the dressing room. There are some essentials in the bathroom, and I've stocked the kitchenette with drinks and snacks. Please make yourself at home. If you need anything at all, just use the intercom. After Evelyn left, Nora sank onto the king-sized bed, the mattress so soft it felt like sinking into a cloud. She ran her hand over the luxurious slate blue duvet. The quiet of the room was absolute. This gilded refuge was more luxurious than the penthouse she had shared with Victor, but it felt entirely different. Victor's home had been a showroom, a stage for his success. Every object chosen for its price tag and its ability to impress his guests. This was a home. It had a soul. But the very perfection of it, the sheer scale of Rowan's wealth and foresight, ignited a familiar anxiety. She had just escaped one gilded cage. Had she simply flown into another, larger one? Victor had used his wealth as a tool of control. His gifts always came with strings attached, his generosity, a debt to be repaid with compliance and adoration. He had bought her loyalty, her silence, her identity. She looked around the beautiful room at the thoughtful details Rowan had arranged for her comfort, and a cold fear crept in. What would Rowan expect in return for this extraordinary rescue? She walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. A deer and its thorns stepped gracefully out of the aspen grove, their movements silent and fluid. They nibbled at the grass, their ears twitching at every sound, wild and free. Nora watched them, her heart aching with a strange mix of wonder and despair. She was safe for now. She had a place to rest, to heal, but she was still utterly dependent on the kindness and the power of a man she barely knew anymore. Rowan's motives remained a mystery, a complex equation she couldn't yet solve. Was this the act of a long-lost friend repaying a childhood bond? Or was it something more? Was he rescuing the girl he remembered, or acquiring a new interesting project? The silence of the mountains seemed to press in on her, vast and imposing. She had been saved from drowning, pulled from the wreckage of her life. But as she stood in this beautiful, silent house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting to find out the true cost of her salvation. That evening, a fire roared in the great room's massive hearth, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the high-beamed ceiling. The scent of pine and woods filled the air, a comforting, earthy perfume. Outside, the sun had dipped below the Tetons, leaving the sky a bruised canvas of violet and indigo pinpricked with the first sharp glitter of stars. Nora had changed into a soft cashmere sweater and leggings she'd found thoughtfully laid out in the dressing room, simple, comfortable clothes in her size. The quiet consideration of the gesture was both touching and unnerving. It implied a level of knowledge about her, a quiet observation that she was still trying to understand. She found Rowan standing by the wall of windows, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, staring out at the darkening mountain range. He wasn't admiring the view so much as communing with it. He seemed as much a part of this wild landscape as the stone and timber of the house itself. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft, not wanting to break the spell of the room. He turned, and the fire light caught the warmth in his eyes. "It's the only place I can think," he said. "The city. It's too loud. Not the sound, the noise, the static from other people's ambitions, their desperation. Out here, the signal is clearer." He gestured to the leather sofa near the fire. "Please sit." He poured a glass of water from a crystal carafe and set it on the rough-hewn wooden table in front of her. He didn't offer her alcohol, another small, considerate detail that did not go unnoticed. They sat in a comfortable silence for a few moments, the crackling fire, a third presence in the room. It was Rowan who finally broke it. I want you to know, Nora, he said, his voice low and serious, that there are no strings attached to you being here. This isn't a transaction. You don't owe me anything. His words were a direct hit, targeting the very heart of her anxiety. It was as if he could read the fear and suspicion swirling within her. Then why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to understand. Generosity on this scale. It doesn't just happen, Rowan. Not in the world I've been living in. He set his drink down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense and unwavering. The world you've been living in is Victor Harrington's world. It's a toxic ecosystem designed to benefit him and no one else. Don't mistake his pathology for the way the entire world works. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I told you I never sent those letters. One of them was written the night I found out I got a full scholarship to Stanford. I was so excited. I wanted to tell you that our pact was still on, that I was just taking a different route. But my mom's new husband, he found the letter. He told me that people like us don't get to have dreams like that I should forget about my fancy friends and focus on getting a trade. He said I was aiming too high, that I would only ever be a failure. Nora could hear the ghost of old pain in his voice, the echo of a wound that had never fully healed. He was wrong, obviously, she said softly. He was, Rowan agreed, a grim tightness around his mouth. But the things people say to you when you're vulnerable, they leave scars. They can become the narrator of your own story if you're not careful. Victor, he became your narrator, didn't he? He spent years telling you who you were, what you were capable of, what you were worth. And his voice was so loud it drowned out your own. Her breath hitched. He saw it. He saw it all. He wasn't just looking at the surface, the broken marriage, the financial distress. He was looking at the invisible cage she had been trapped in, the psychological labyrinth Victor had constructed around her. He made me feel small, she confessed, the admission costing her a piece of her pride, like I was crazy. He'd say things, then deny he ever said them. He'd twist my words until I didn't even know what I was trying to say anymore. Towards the end, I stopped talking. It was easier. Gaslighting. Rowan said the word a cold, hard stone in the warmth of the room. It's a classic abuser's tactic. Isolate, destabilize, and control. Make the victim doubt their own sanity so they become completely dependent. He stood up and walked over to the massive telescope standing in the corner by the window. He fiddled with the lens, his back to her. I know something about being controlled, about people trying to write your story for you. When I started my company, I had partners, men like Victor. They saw a smart kid with a good idea they could steal. They tried to push me out, to dilute my shares, to take everything. I fought them. It nearly destroyed me. But I learned something. Power isn't just about money. It's about owning your own narrative. Victor took yours. I'm just giving you a quiet place to write a new one. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. That's why I'm doing this, Nora. Because no one should have their voice stolen. And because someone a long time ago told me I could build rockets if I wanted to. And for the first time in my life, I believed it was possible. He was talking about her. She remembered that day sitting in their treehouse, sketching designs for a spaceship on a napkin while he explained astrophysics. She had looked at him with his fierce eyes and brilliant mind, and had said it without a second thought. You could do that for real, Rowan. You could build rockets. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or fear. It was a tear of release. He wasn't saving a victim. He was repaying a debt of faith. He didn't move to comfort her, didn't rush to fill the emotional space. He gave her the dignity of her own moment, a quiet act of respect that was more comforting than any embrace could have been. Later that night, as she lay in the impossibly comfortable bed, staring through the glass wall at the blanket of stars, so clear and bright out here, away from the city's glow, she thought about constellations. They were just random points of light, but people had drawn lines between them, creating stories, heroes, and myths. Victor had drawn a constellation around her life and told her it was a cage. Rowan was suggesting she could draw a new one. For the first time in 5 years, as she drifted off to sleep, she didn't hear Victor's voice in her head. She heard the crackle of a fire, the whisper of the wind, and the faint revolutionary echo of her own forgotten strength. The next few days passed in a slow, healing rhythm. Nora slept more than she had in years. Deep restorative sleeps, free from the gnawing anxiety that had been her constant companion. She woke late to the sight of sunlight dappling through the aspen leaves and drank tea in her private sitting room, watching the wildlife wander past her window. She took long solitary walks along the pine-scent trails that crisscrossed Rowan's vast property. The crisp mountain air a balm to her soul. Rowan was a phantom presence. He left her to her solitude, a gesture she was profoundly grateful for. He was there, a steady, unobtrusive force in the background, but he never crowded her. They would sometimes share a quiet breakfast or a simple dinner prepared by his housekeeper, a warm grandmotherly woman named Rosa Martinez. Their conversations were easy, drifting from books to art to the changing seasons. He never once asked about Victor, never pried into the raw, unhealed wounds of her marriage. He gave her space. He gave her peace. She felt herself slowly unfurling like a plant that had been kept in the dark for too long, finally turning its leaves toward the sun. The constant tension in her shoulders began to dissipate. The tremor in her hands stilled. She started to read again, losing herself in the worlds of fiction and history she found in her small library. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly connect with the new life inside her, not as a complication or a secret, but as a part of her future. She would lay her hand on her still flat stomach and whisper to the baby, promising it a world of safety and love, a world free from the shadow of its father. One afternoon, seeking a new book, she ventured into the main library in the West Wing, a room she hadn't yet explored. It was even more impressive than the Great Room, 2 stories high with rolling ladders and a small wrought iron spiral staircase leading to a gallery overhead. The air smelled of old leather and paper. This was the heart of the house, the core of Rowan's mind. She was running her fingers along the spines of a collection of poetry when a television discreetly set into the bookshelves flickered to life. It was tuned to a 24-hour business news channel. Rosa Martinez must have been cleaning earlier and left it on. Nora moved to turn it off, but the name the anchor said stopped her cold. Victor Harrington, CEO of Harrington Holdings, is facing increased scrutiny today as stock prices took another dive following the announcement of a federal investigation. Nora froze, her hand hovering over the remote. The screen showed a picture of Victor looking confident and defiant striding out of their old apartment building. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read Harrington Holdings under investigation for insider trading. Her heart began to pound a heavy, sick rhythm against her ribs. Insider trading. She remembered conversations, snippets of late-night phone calls she'd overheard but had been trained to ignore. Victor speaking in clipped, angry tones about a rival company, about a deal that was a sure thing. She'd asked him about it once, and he had dismissed her with a sharp, "Don't worry your pretty little head about it, Nora. This is out of your league." The news anchor continued. The investigation seems to be centered around the controversial acquisition of Aerodyne Technologies, a smaller aerospace firm 6 months ago. Sources say the SEC is looking into suspiciously timed stock trades made by entities connected to Harrington just weeks before the merger was announced. Aerodyne Technologies. The name hit Nora like a physical blow. A memory sharp and vivid erupted in her mind. It was from about 7 months ago. She was in her small home office, a space Victor had grudgingly allowed her, researching small, innovative art galleries for a potential future project, a dream she still harbored. She had stumbled across an article about corporate patronage of the arts and saw a mention of Aerodyne, a company lauded for its employee-first culture and its funding of local arts programs. Intrigued, she'd spent an hour reading about them, even printing out their mission statement and a few articles. Later that evening, Victor had come into her office, a rare occurrence. He'd seen the papers on her desk. "What's this?" he'd asked, his tone deceptively casual. She had explained her interest, praising the company's ethos. He had listened, a strange, intense look in his eyes, asking more questions than he usually did about her hobbies. The next day, the papers had vanished from her desk. When she'd asked, he claimed the cleaners must have thrown them out. He had then, out of the blue, gifted her with a lavish diamond bracelet, telling her he was proud of her for taking an interest in the real world, and then steered the conversation away, making her feel foolish for her little project. She saw it now. It hadn't been a coincidence. He hadn't been interested in her hobby. He had been pumping her for information. Had he thought she had some inside track, or was he simply taking the name, A random breadcrumb she had innocently picked up and weaving it into one of his schemes? He had used her. Her innocent research had become a tool in his corporate rating. The bracelet hadn't been a gift. It had been a distraction, a shiny object to make her forget. The room began to spin. The depth of his manipulation, the way he had twisted even her most harmless passions to serve his own greed, was staggering. She felt dirty, complicit. A floorboard creaked on the gallery above. Nora looked up, startled. Rowan was standing there, leaning against the railing. He wasn't looking at the television. He was looking at her. His face was impassive, but his eyes held a deep, knowing sorrow. He had seen her reaction. He had known this news would break. The realization dawned, cold and terrifying. Had he known all along? Was this investigation the reason he had swooped in to rescue her? Was she not a long-lost friend, but a pawn in a much larger game? A game between him and Victor. You knew, she said, the words a choked accusation. You knew this was happening. He didn't deny it. He just watched her, his expression a mask of calm control that suddenly looked chillingly familiar. It was the same calm Victor wore when he was about to reveal a devastating trump card. The sanctuary suddenly felt like a prison again. The gilded refuge, a beautifully constructed trap, the man who had saved her from her monster. Was he just another monster, one who was simply better at hiding his teeth? The tremor had returned to her hands, and this time it was not from weakness, but from a cold, terrifying rage. The silence in the library stretched, taut and fragile as a spider's thread. The only sound was the drone of the news anchor's voice, a meaningless buzz against the roaring in Nora's ears. Rowan's impassive gaze from the gallery above felt like a physical weight pressing down on her, suffocating her. How long have you known? Nora's voice was dangerously quiet, stripped of all its earlier softness. How long have you known Victor was being investigated? Rowan walked slowly to the spiral staircase, his steps measured and deliberate. He descended without taking his eyes off her, his movements fluid and controlled. He stopped on the last step, creating a careful distance between them. My company was one of the ones he outbid for Aerodyne, he said, his voice a low, even tone that did nothing to soothe her rising panic. He came out of nowhere with an offer that was wildly inflated. It didn't make sense. It smelled wrong from the beginning. So, I had my people look into it quietly. The cold clinical explanation was worse than an outburst would have been. It was business. All of it. Your people? Nora echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. So this entire rescue, my divorce, that motel room, was that just part of your quiet investigation? Was I an entity connected to Harrington that you needed to get on your side? She could see the flicker of pain in his eyes at her accusation, but his composure remained absolute. No, Nora, finding you like that. That was never part of the plan. So there was a plan, she shot back, taking a step away from him, needing the space. A plan that involved me. What was it, Rowan? Were you going to use me as a witness? Get me to testify against him? Is that the price for staying in this gilded refuge? The price of you being here, he said, his voice finally hardening, a steel edge creeping into his calm tone, is that you are safe. The price is that the man who systematically destroyed your confidence is about to be held accountable for his crimes. The price is that you and your baby get to have a future that isn't dictated by his whims. Don't you dare talk about my baby, she flared, her hand instinctively flying to her stomach. Don't you dare use my child as a justification for your corporate chess game. This stopped being a game when I saw the settlement agreement. He counted, his voice rising to match hers. When I saw he'd left you with nothing after 5 years of your life, when I realized he'd thrown you away like a broken toy, the investigation was already happening. Nora, it would have happened with or without you. But when I saw your name on that divorce decree, it became personal. He finally broke, the mask of control cracking. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she remembered so vividly from their teenage years. Damn it, Nora. I didn't know you were pregnant until Evelyn told me on the way to the airfield. Do you really think I'm that much of a monster to use that against you? His vehemence gave her pause. The raw emotion in his voice felt real, unscripted. But she had been fooled by experts. Victor was a monster in a bespoke suit, she said, her voice trembling. You're something else. You hide your motives behind kindness. You manipulate with logic and sanctuary. At least with Victor, I knew the rules. What are your rules, Rowan? What do you really want from me? He closed the distance between them, stopping just a foot away. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. The firelight cast his face in sharp relief. All angles and shadows. "You want to know what I want?" he asked, his voice now a low, intense whisper that vibrated through the room. "I want to erase the last 15 years. I want to go back to that treehouse and tell you not to get on that bus to New York. I want to tell you to wait for me. I want the girl who believed I could build rockets before a man like Victor convinced her she couldn't even run her own life." His confession, so raw and unexpected, shattered her anger, leaving her exposed and trembling. This wasn't about Aerodyne. This wasn't about revenge against a corporate rival. This was about them. "That girl is gone, Rowan," she whispered, the words a lament. Victor broke her. "No," he said, his voice fierce, his eyes boring into hers. He didn't. He chipped away at her. He buried her under layers of fear and self-doubt. But he didn't break her. "I see her. She's standing right in front of me. She's the one who had the strength to finally sign those papers. The one who survived that first night alone. The one who was brave enough to get on a plane with a ghost." He reached out not to touch her, but held his hand in the space between them, his palm open. An offering, a plea. "I should have told you about the investigation," he said, his voice softening with regret. "That was my mistake. I was trying to protect you from it, to give you a space to heal before the world came crashing in again. I was wrong. I see that now. From here on, Nora, no more secrets, no more plans you're not a part of. Just the truth." The library was silent again. The news on the television had moved on to another story. In the aftermath of their confrontation, a fragile, uncertain space had opened up. He had lied by omission, manipulating the circumstances to bring her here, but his reasons were a tangled mess of regret, long-held affection, and a fierce protective anger on her behalf. He wasn't a monster, but he wasn't a simple hero either. He was a man, complex and morally gray, who had used his immense power to right a wrong he felt partially responsible for. He had reached back in time to save the girl he had left behind. The question was, what did she, the woman she was now, do with that? Could she trust this new complicated truth? Could she build a future on a foundation that had begun with a secret? She looked at his outstretched hand, then into his eyes, and saw not a chess master, but the boy he had been trapped inside a billionaire's life, reaching for a connection he had lost. And for the first time she felt a tremor, not of fear, but of a terrifying, exhilarating possibility. The weeks that followed the confrontation in the library were a period of delicate, intentional reconstruction. The secret was out, the air cleared of its toxic, unspoken weight. Rowan was true to his word. He was relentlessly transparent, updating her on the Harrington investigation, which was escalating daily, but only when she asked. He treated her not as a fragile victim, but as an equal, a partner in her own life. He set up a secure video conference with a team of top-tier lawyers he had retained on her behalf. They spoke to her with respect, ensuring she understood that she was not a target of the investigation, but that her testimony about Victor's behavior and conversations she may have overheard could be valuable. The choice to cooperate, they stressed, was entirely hers. There was no pressure from them, or from Rowan. For the first time, Nora felt the tectonic plates of her life shifting. The power was flowing back to her. She was no longer a passive object being acted upon, but the agent of her own destiny. After a long sleepless night spent staring at the stardust Wyoming sky, she made her decision. She would cooperate, not for Rowan's revenge, and not even for justice against Victor. She would do it for herself and for the child she carried. She would do it to formally excise Victor's narrative from her life, to replace his lies with her truth spoken in her own voice under oath if need be. It was the final definitive act of taking her power back. Her decision seemed to settle something in the house in the dynamic between her and Rowan. The last vestiges of awkwardness between them dissolved, replaced by the easy, comfortable companionship she remembered from their youth. They fell back into their old rhythm. Two intelligent, curious minds sparking off each other. They debated philosophy by the fire, argued politics over dinner, and one clear, cold night, he took her to the small observatory he had built on a nearby ridge. As she looked through the powerful telescope, the rings of Saturn sharp and clear against the black velvet of space, Rowan stood beside her, his voice a low, steady presence in the dark. "You know," he murmured, "the light from some of those stars has been traveling for millions of years. We're looking at the past, at ghosts. Maybe we're all just looking at ghosts, she replied, pulling back from the eyepiece, her gaze finding his in the dim light, trying to make sense of the light they left behind. Or maybe, he said, his voice dropping, we get to choose which ones we look at. Maybe we can stop looking at the ones that burned out long ago and focus on the ones that are still burning right here, right now. The air grew thick with unspoken meaning. In the quiet intimacy of the observatory, surrounded by the silent, ancient light of the cosmos, the 15 years they had spent apart seemed to meld away, an insignificant blip in the grand scheme of things. He wasn't the billionaire titan, and she wasn't the broken divorce. They were just Rowan and Nora, two souls who had taken a long, painful detour to find their way back to each other. A few days later, a package arrived for her. It was a large flat box. Inside, she found a complete architectural plan and a prospectus. The title on the cover read, "The Vale Gallery for Emerging Artists, Northwood." She looked up at Rowan, who was leaning in the doorway of her sitting room, his expression carefully neutral. Northwood is a designated arts and culture revitalization zone, he explained as if he were discussing a business proposal. There are grants, tax incentives, that old abandoned mill on the river. It's for sale. It has good bones. It would make a perfect gallery space, a nonprofit. I took the liberty of setting up an endowment to cover operating costs for the first 10 years. The rest, he finished, his voice softening, is up to the director. Tears streamed down her face. But this time they were tears of overwhelming, unadulterated joy. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't charity. It was her dream. The one Victor had mocked and dismissed, rendered in perfect practical detail. He hadn't just given her a safe harbor. He had given her a future, her own future, one she would build with her own hands in the town where they had both begun, a place she could finally truly call home. That evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to drift down from a slate-gray sky, Nora found him by the great window, watching the storm roll in. She walked up behind him and for the first time initiated contact, her hand resting gently on his arm. He turned, his eyes asking a silent question. "Thank you, Rowan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Nora," he said. "I'm not thanking you for the gallery," she clarified, her gaze steady and sure. "Or the lawyers, or the jet. I'm thanking you for seeing me, the real me, the one I thought I'd lost forever." He covered her hand with his thumb gently stroking her skin. The touch was electric, a current of warmth and long-suppressed emotion that flowed between them. "I never lost sight of her," he said, his voice a low caress. Not for a single day. Victor's world had been one of power imbalances, betrayal, and psychological warfare. He had sneered that she would beg to come back, confident in the prison he had built for her. But he had fundamentally misunderstood her. He had never seen her strength, only a reflection of his own needs. He never imagined a world beyond his control. A world where a promise made by two kids in a treehouse held more power than all his billions. Victor Harrington's story was ending. A sordid tale of greed and hubris destined for the tabloids. But Nora Vale's story was just beginning. Surrounded by the quiet majesty of the mountains, with a new life growing inside her, and an old friend standing by her side, she was finally rewriting her own stars, drawing a new constellation of hope, redemption, and love in the vast open sky. Nora's journey from a silenced wife to the master of her own destiny shows that the cruelest prisons are the ones we don't realize we're in. Her story is a testament to the quiet strength that lies within us all and the power of a single act of kindness to change everything. Victor was so sure of his power, but he forgot that some connections can't be bought or broken. If this story of resilience, redemption, and the surprising ways the past can save us resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more tales of overcoming the odds. What did you think of Rowan's actions? Let us know in the comments below.